But let's go back to the training to be a Civil War surgeon. There's really two methods, okay, of training to be a doctor in the Civil War era. One, which most of you would already know, is your university. I went to the University of Pennsylvania and Thomas Jefferson University. Was trained extensively in surgery. However, the vast majority of the doctors who serve in the Civil War are in fact medical doctors, but they were taught through the apprenticeship. So if my father was a doctor, which he was, and he says, well, I want you to be a doctor, I had to go to no formal training other than to his office every day and be trained on the same patients day in and day out, week in and week out. Very little hands-on training with the tools of a surgeon, rather sharp instruments. And when he said I was ready to be a doctor and take over for him, I was a doctor. Now the problem with that, it showed its face at the First Battle of Manassas, when everybody was choosing their sides, north and south, putting on the pretty uniform, blue or gray, calling themselves a Civil War surgeon, and the vast amount of wounded came into the field hospitals, which we'll touch on in a little bit. And those of us who were surgeons and familiar with some of the tools of our trade conducted ourselves fairly well, you know. However, those that were new to the Civil War surgery and were in fact just your local mountain doctor were looking at the tools and saying, well, what are these? The problem was that there were 50 men lying there dying, waiting for an amputation of some sort or some sort of medical care, and these gentlemen didn't really know what to do. So they learned under fire, so to say, and some of them learned rather costly. The hospital steward would hand the surgeon their knife, their capital knife. They put their hand down and start to incise the skin, and the hospital steward would say, where did that finger come from? It's a very true story. It happened quite a bit, especially in the early part of the war. They were not accustomed to the tools. They were extremely sharp. Most of the surgeons sharpened their own tools, okay? And at times very crudely. And you put your hand down and start to cut through, and sure enough, you're cutting your own fingers off. So we get into the breakdown of medicine. On the Confederate side, as well as the Federal side, there are field hospitals. Your very first level of care once you were wounded. On the Confederate side, we had something called the Infirmary Corps. The Infirmary Corps were elite soldiers who were willing to put their guns down, march out in line of battle, however, drop their guns and pick up a stretcher and remove the wounded from the field. Now those gentlemen had to wear red hat bands or red armbands, because if the 2,000 of us are heading that way into battle, and we turn around and we see 20 of our so-called fellow soldiers going that way, what are we going to think? Correct. So they have these red armbands that say Ambulance Corps, and their job was strictly to control bleeding and to remove these wounded soldiers from the field, much like your first combat medics, although they weren't considered that, but that's what they were. On the Federal side, they did it a little different. They used some of the older soldiers that really couldn't get out there in combat anymore. They used the cooks, and they used the band. Personally, I like my side, but whatever works. Now, in the field hospital, you have an assistant surgeon. The assistant surgeon has many responsibilities. One of those responsibilities, I think we touched on a little bit over here earlier, was the morning call. Many soldiers came down with the fever and various diseases, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and they were permitted to go through their sergeant to the morning call, and they would see the surgeon. The surgeon would simply sit at a desk and ask them what is wrong. Very rarely would they actually examine them. They had very little time to do morning call because they were out taking care of those who had amputations or head injuries, etc. For those who didn't hear the question about the blue mass earlier, an example of morning call was a soldier would come in and say they have diarrhea, dysentery, they have the screamers. Doc, I can't go out into battle. What can I do? You tell the orderly, give them 2 of the blue mass, the blue pill. And sure enough, in a day or two, their problem subsided, but their abdominal pain was greater. Their stomach pain was much greater. That's because the blue mass was actually mercury. So it took care of their initial problem, but it ultimately led to their death in many cases. So, thank God we don't do that today. The assistant surgeon's job in battle was to follow the regiment into battle, about 100 yards behind. And unfortunately, as the soldiers would drop to the ground, he would essentially assess their condition. He would have knapsacks and canteens. The knapsacks would be full of tourniquets, simple block tourniquets. Many soldiers actually carried them themselves. They were so simple to make. But the assistant surgeon would have these tourniquets, and he would find a soldier laying on the field and had a partial amputation from a cannon blast, and he would apply this tourniquet, and in some cases actually take his saw right then and there and remove the rest of the limb. Leave the soldier on the field for the infirmary corps to come and remove them to the rear. Okay? There were some assistant surgeons who lost their lives, not very many, but some did. It's rather hazardous work, but it was an important job. Now, when they were finished with that, they came back to the field hospital and they saw the surgeon in charge. In my particular case, the 2nd Corps Field Hospital, the surgeon in charge is Dr. Harvey Black. Those 2 surgeons would be the primary surgeons on duty, and their duty may last 2 or 3 days. Now here at Gettysburg, for example, the 2nd Corps Field Hospital set up at the Daniel Lady Farm. It was just outside of Gettysburg. And in 3 days, we saw 2,200 wounded soldiers. Now I, as the medical director of the 2nd Corps, based where my office would be in that particular hospital, participated in the treatment of those 2,200. But 3 doctors for 2,200 people over just about 3 days. There was no rest. 24 hours a day for 3 days, we took care of those soldiers. In the field hospital, there are different aspects that make it work. You have your medical, you have your infirmary corps, but you have your chaplain. There's always a chaplain assigned to the hospital. The chaplain did a lot of good things, comforted the sick and the dying, mediated any differences between the sides, because yes, in fact, we did treat Yankees. For the most part, I'd like to say that they're treated the same way as our fine Southern gentlemen are. Not always, but for the most part. We had cooks, laundress. It's a city within itself, to tell you the truth. It's very self-contained. The soldiers might be there for up to 4, 5, 6 days, and God willing, they're able to be moved to the intermediate hospital. They would be taken there for more extensive care, and then ultimately taken to Richmond for a general hospital care if needed. Now, a question that was asked yesterday here was, what happens if a soldier has an amputation, would they be allowed to, if they so chose, to return to duty? And the answer to that is, it would depend on your rank. Most foot soldiers to your lower officer rank would not. They would be discharged and returned home, especially if it was a leg. You have officers like General Hood, who lost a leg in one battle, an arm in another battle. As soon as he could possibly get his prosthetic device fitted, he was on his horse. So the answer to that question was yes, but it depends on your rank. In Gettysburg, as George mentioned earlier, there were about 51,000 casualties. 28,000 Confederate, about 22,000 Federal in 3 days. And what we do with all those casualties? Now, the casualties are described as killed, wounded, or missing in action. Every farm, the barns, the way houses, libraries, churches, schools were utilized as a field hospital. 51,000 wounded, killed and wounded, is a large number for a small area like this. And the surgeons, were extremely taxed. There were not a great deal of surgeons. You may have one per regiment at the start of the war. By the middle of the war, you may have one surgeon for every 2.5 regiments. So, as I said before, these doctors were pretty busy. Confederate Army, the wagons would bring the wounded, for example, to the 2nd Corps Field Hospital, full 5, 6, 7 soldiers at a time. This would go on for most of the day into the night. There was no such thing as saying that we're full. Many, many soldiers laid out with no shelter, no cover, in grass, much like what you see here, only 2 feet tall, waiting for someone to attend to their wounds. Many laid on the battlefield for a very long time. Some never made it to the field hospital. Some laid in the field and died 2-3 days later.